Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Apologies, everybody. Yes, they changed my login on Zoom for the school, so that took longer than expected.
Okay, we're live.
Beautiful, thank you. I call this meeting to order. The time is 6:04 p.m. The date is Thursday, December 2nd, 2021. This is a meeting of the City of Berkeley's Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. Pursuant to Section 3 of Executive Order N2920, issued by Governor Newsom on March 17, 2020, this meeting of the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force will be conducted exclusively through teleconference and Zoom video conference. Please be advised that pursuant to the executive order, and I also believe city policy currently now, there will be no physical meeting location available. Please be advised, pursuant to the executive order, and to ensure the health and safety of the public by limiting human contact that could spread the COVID-19 virus, there will be no physical meeting location available. I'm saying the same things, not a good start. Alrighty. Let's go to roll call, please.
Commissioner Fine,
Here.
Vice Chair Chima,
Here.
Commissioner Jigu, Commissioner Crook,
Oh, sorry, it took a long time to get off you.
no worries, I saw you, thank you. Commissioner Lindheim, Commissioner Dangerfield,
Present.
Commissioner Ghosh,
Present. Did you hear me?
yes, thank you.
Okay,
You made it,
thank
thank
you.
you. Commissioner Hyde,
Present.
Commissioner Malvido, Commissioner Thompson,
Here.
Chair Mizell,
Here.
Commissioner Opton,
Here.
Commissioner Moon, Commissioner Harger,
Present.
Commissioner Lutzker, Commissioner Jigu,
Here.
and Commissioner Ho is absent tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and see the public comment.
We have one hand up. Cordell Hindler, you should be able to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. So good evening, Chair Mizell, task force members. My name is Cordell Henley, and I have some Christmas gifts for you all. So you are cordially invited to attend a performance of Home for the Holidays at Contra Costa Civic Theater tomorrow evening through Sunday at 7:30. Tickets are only $40 for adults, but if you get the youth rate, it's $20. So you just show your proof of vaccination and wear your mask inside. And what else? That's the only thing, because let's see. And I will save my comments for after the presenters finish speaking. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Kelly Hammergren. You should be allowed to speak.
Thank you. Can you just tell me how many attendees you have tonight? And that's it. I'm anxious to watch the meeting, but I'd like to know how many members of the public are here.
We currently have 6 attendees.
Thank you.
Chair Mizell, that is it for public comment.
Thank you. We'll go right ahead to approval of the minutes from our November 18th meeting. Are there any questions, comments, concerns about the minutes? Seeing none, I'll motion to approve the minutes.
I second it.
Motion for me, second from Vice Chair Chima. Let's go ahead and call the roll, please.
Commissioner Fine,
Yes.
Vice Chair Chima,
Yes.
Commissioner Jigu,
Yes.
Commissioner Crook,
Yes.
Commissioner Linheim, Commissioner Dangerfield,
Yes.
Commissioner Ghosh,
I'm gonna abstain.
noted. Commissioner Hyde,
Abstain.
was that Commissioner Hyde abstain as well?
That was, I think, Barnali repeating herself, and I'm a yes.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Malvido, Commissioner Thompson,
Yes.
Chair Mizell,
Yes.
Commissioner Opton,
Yes.
Commissioner Moon, Commissioner Harger,
Yes.
Commissioner Letzker, and Commissioner Ho. Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you. Okay, going on to our next item. Do we have Dr. Jones here yet, or I'm not seeing him? Huh. Commissioner Harger, not trying to put you on the spot. You have any?
No idea,
One
but
sec.
I can shoot her an email. I'll do that right now.
Okay.
Also, just to note, I'm going to resend her panelist link as well right now, just in the event that something happened. So perhaps
Yeah, I
we
appreciate
can
it.
motion to move on.
Yeah, in the meantime, yeah, it's all right if we take the prerogative to move to our next item and come back to Dr. Jones. So, you know, if she does appear in the next minute or so, I would ask Task Force if we could double back. Okay, in that case, let's go to our community meeting schedule and final report update. I think that's a bit of a collective thing between Buna and I. Vice Chair, do you want to start, or should I start?
I can just talk about the meetings. I thought this was Nick Jr.'s. But I could be.
Oh, the community meeting schedule. Oh, my apologies.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, yeah, I'm thinking about next.
I could make some stuff up, you know that.
No, Cheryl, my apologies. I'm thinking of our next item.
Vice Chair Chima, go for it. No. Thank you, Commissioner Mizell. So we have the community meeting schedule. I have shared the new flyer with the city in both English and Spanish, and we have dates scheduled for January 13th, January 20th, January 26th, and then February 3rd will be in person. And we all know that, you know, the outreach is really important on this to make sure that community members from each of the districts attend. We know that they are sort of focused on districts, but people are welcome to come to whichever one they can make. And then you, sorry, go ahead.
Cheryl, will the Zooms for each of these time date Zoom links will be sent out?
Yep, the city has the flyer and the meeting link is on there, and it's the same meeting link for all 4 meetings.
Okay.
And then it will be posted on the website as well. So it'll be a pop-up on the website that people can see it. The report, the latest update on the report is on the website as well. And you should all have received that.
Thank you. Yeah, commissioners, any questions in terms of the report update or the community meeting schedule?
No, if you're asking about the task force, the next task force meeting?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
More the community meetings. Okay. Wow, seeing none. Guess we can go ahead and move on then. Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, thank you for the report update. Obviously, in our next step section, we're going to discuss some of our plan as hopefully as subcommittees to respond to the report. But yeah, look forward to the next stage in the process with you. So thank you. Okay, in that case, let's go to subcommittee reports. Starting with policing and budgets.
Nathan, I'm sorry, my
yes.
raise hand function wasn't working. I apologize.
There you go.
I was wondering when the District 7 community meeting is going to be, because it is important that students are back in session and have been at least for a minute when that meeting happens.
Thank you. That is a incredibly good point.
So it's scheduled for January 26th.
Okay. I think we'll be back. What is that, like a week? I think. Okay. Well, at least we'll be back. We'll definitely on our end as students have to figure out some legwork to get people there. But I am glad it's happening when we're there. So, Commissioner Lutzker.
Hi, thanks. I'm not sure if this is the right time to ask this, but Cheryl, I'm wondering, there was a summary of some of the changes in this report, but like very broad. I'm wondering if it's possible that there would be like a track changes version so that we could really see what was added and what was taken away. It's hard, like it's a long document, hard to track. And also whether there will be any like responses to the individual questions and concerns outlined by each of the subcommittees that were sent to you.
So I can look into both of those. I know that we received all of them. Yeah, and then I think the primary changes and additions are on pages 22 and 43 of the report. And then other changes are primarily, they're more minor changes, but the bulk of the changes are on pages 22 and 43. Those major additions that were requested.
Commissioner Harker.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, is it too late to push the District 7 meeting back a little bit? Because students will have like pretty much just gotten back to campus, and we want to try to have as like robust a response from students as possible. Like if we could shuffle it to have that a little bit later, I think we'd get a lot more engagement from students.
So I think that's a discussion with the city. I think right now we're scheduled to present to the city council the week of the 22nd, which is another important date that you should know. So I think given that, we can discuss with the city sort of what is available to do that.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, yeah, I also say thank you. And in my end, Commissioner Harger, yeah, I can. Yeah, in our next meeting, have that conversation about seeing if we can get it, a week later or so. Because again, I do appreciate it being while students are here, though, as Commissioner Harger knows, it is difficult, especially after the first week of semester, to get students to show up when they've just barely have their classes situated. And they're not quite usually thinking about, okay, what am I doing outside of the classroom? But yeah, we'll have a conversation with the city and see what's possible. Okay, see no other hands for this item. Again, thank you again, Cheryl. Assuming it's all right. Task force, we'll go ahead here and double back to our first item, which is yes, Ms. Cole.
Chair Mizell, we have Dr. Jones on now. So if we're done with subcommittee reports, we can circle back and I can promote her. Just let me know when.
Yeah, from a just from a Brown Act perspective, can we just go to Dr. Jones first? I think so. So
Yes, can we
Yeah.
just make a motion to reorder? Thank you.
I'll make the motion. Go ahead, Nathan, you have it.
sure. Motion to reorder the agenda to take up the item from Dr. Jones before subcommittee reports, even though we, I guess, skipped the item earlier in our agenda.
Second.
Any discussion? Okay, let's call
And
it.
I'll call roll. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Fine,
Yes.
Vice Chair Chima,
Yes.
Commissioner Jigu,
Yes.
Commissioner Crook, Commissioner Lindheim,
I'm sorry, I missed mute again. This is Jamie Crook, yes.
okay, thank you. Noted. Commissioner Dangerfield,
Yes.
Commissioner Ghosh,
Yes.
Commissioner Hyde,
Yes.
Commissioner Malvito, Commissioner Thompson,
Yes.
Chair Mizell,
Yes.
Commissioner Opton,
Yes.
Commissioner Moon, Commissioner Harger,
Yes.
Commissioner Lutzker,
Yes.
and Commissioner Ho is absent. Thank you. Motion passes, and I will now promote Dr. Thompson so that she's able to present.
Dr. Jones, but
Or Dr. Jones, I'm so sorry. A lot to remember. My apologies, Dr. Jones.
No, that's fine. My apologies for getting a bit mixed up on the time. And so thank you for having me here today. And just so for a reminder for myself, I have about 30 minutes. Is that 30 minutes for the presentation and the Q&A?
yeah, though the Q&A, can really go more at the task force discretion. The presentation wise, about half an hour.
Great. Okay. And so what I have today will be a set of comments. And just briefly as an introduction, I'm Nikki Jones. I'm a professor in the Department of African American Studies. I'm also the chair there. I'm trained as a sociologist and criminologist. And I've written books on violence that center Black communities, Black communities that are most impacted by violence. And I've also done research on the other side of that dividing line. And so spent some time over the last decade interviewing officers, collecting video recordings with and from law enforcement, and have developed, I think, a rich understanding of the problems of policing, and certainly the problems that we are confronting in the present moment, and have been very involved in thinking and researching methods and ways to reimagine community safety. And this is work that certainly began before the summer of 2020 and has been motivated by all that's happened since then. And thinking about what to share with you in the time that I have today, and understanding the challenge that you have in front of you and all of the work that you've done so far, and thinking about the title of my presentation, Research for Reimagining Community Safety, I imagine that you have been steeped in research. And certainly there's a good deal of research out there to guide your work, and I'm sure that it is guiding your work. And so for me, the question is, what is the best way to share what I know and what I know about what others know with you today? And I've decided that what I want to do is to bring us back to some guiding thoughts, values, principles around the work that you are doing and that we are doing, that I'm doing with others when it comes to transformation and reimagining. Why are we all here? Why are we doing this work on policing? And what are the problems with policing? And so I'm going to talk just briefly about that. And I really want to center and recenter, and I'm sure this is already a part of your work, the problem of racism and systemic racism, right? That is really motivated so much of the talk around transformation. and not simply reform in the post-Floyd moment. And I will share some research that I've done, a paper that I'm working on. It's currently under review with the graduate research assistants at Berkeley that helps to shed some light on that. And I think it helps us to think about the real problems with policing. And I also want to share a little bit of insight from work that I've done analyzing video recordings of people who are the targets of encounters. And so in real time, what are they complaining about? What are they concerned about? And I know this is something that you've tried to get to in the work that you're doing now and soliciting input from the committee and so from the community. And so I thought I'd share some out about that. And then also to encourage us to embrace, re-embrace that abolitionist imagination that was released in the post-Floyd moment, in the months following the murder of George Floyd and in the uprisings. What we saw in that moment, if we take a step back, is a rupture from reform, right? Reform only or narrow reforms. And we saw an insistence, and whether or not you identified as an abolitionist, an insistence on real transformative change. Now, as we move out in months and months past that moment, and certainly past the guilty verdict of last spring, the urgency of that can go away. And when you get into work like this, you begin to see the retrenchment of reformist efforts, not because people don't care anymore, but because the work in front of you is some distance from the urgency of the moment. And so how do you maintain your tie to that moment, right? And when I think about the work that I do, I think about that, as well, right? We think about the changes that are happening right now, what we know now, it is because of what happened in Minneapolis and everything that happened beyond that. And certainly one of the things that happened is that we shifted our understanding of racism in policing. We shifted the national narrative on racism in policing. And as someone who's been studying this for some time, prior to the murder of George Floyd, and even in the era of Black Lives Matter, there were kind of two main paradigms for understanding racism in policing. And one was the bad apples paradigm. So you have these explicitly racist officers or officers who hold explicitly racist beliefs. And that because they're in this profession that brings them into close contact with marginalized populations, they're able to exploit that, right? And do harm to people in the community, right? And certainly Derek Chauvin was imagined and constructed as a bad apple. And certainly his actions were beyond what we would expect from a police officer or from a human being. And we know, right, that there is a good deal of violence that occurs in policing that is not that line, right, that is beyond the line of Derek Chauvin. And still, right, so this idea of bad apples in policing, and then the other really prominent paradigm at the time was the unconscious bias or implicit bias. And so this is the idea that all of us are a little bit racist, whether we know it or not. We have this shorthand categories and we're socialized into certain kinds of thinking by virtue of being is socialized in the context in which we live, which is rooted in common associations of Blackness with suspicion, danger, and threat. And because of that, all of us have this kind of short circuiting that happens. And that's more dangerous when it's a police officer and a police officer who's thinking about whether or not they are going to pull a gun. And so the idea is that, or treat someone differently. So the idea is that these implicit biases or in this paradigm lead to disparities in the treatment and fuel differential treatment. And so if you have these two paradigms, you have the bad apples paradigm, what is the intervention? What do you do? Well, you get rid of the bad apples, you punish them, right? Or you discipline them, or you remove them from the force. If the problem is unconscious bias, if it's in your head, then the training is the intervention. And the idea is to get into the heads of officers. And certainly millions of dollars has been spent on trainings in implicit bias and unconscious bias and trying to, train away the racism that's rooted in people's minds. And this is the kind of work that was happening in police departments all across the country in the pre-Floyd era. But what we know and what I know from the work that I've done is that officers also hold really explicit biases, right? And why is this important? I want us to kind of hold this when we're thinking about interventions, right? Because if we don't understand what it is, what the problem is, right, then we can do a lot of work that doesn't actually get at the root of the problem. And the root of the problem isn't necessarily what we think either. And so we know that officers hold really explicit biases that they would talk about, biases that they share with me and my research team when we were doing our field work. A Pew Research Center poll in 2016 found that 56% of officers in the US reported a belief that an aggressive rather than courteous approach is more effective in certain neighborhoods, right? An aggressive rather than a courteous approach is more effective, right? More effective as a policing tool in certain neighborhoods, right? And we can think about what those neighborhoods are in the Bay Area, in Berkeley, and we have to ask ourselves, how is it that these really explicit biases exist in policing in an era that, up until this moment, was the era of fair and unbiased policing? And so what I want us to think about is a finding from our work where we interviewed officers during the course of ride-alongs, and this is a paper that's currently under review. It's not yet published, and I can share it out once it is published. But we interviewed them in a major city on the West Coast and asked them about why they did the things that they did. And one of the things that what they revealed quite quickly is just the quote that I just shared, is that there is an idea that certain people in certain places respond to certain kinds of treatment, right? And you can think about the ways in which that's racially coded. And I won't go into the kind of deep technical detail of the kind of analysis of language that we do that helps to reveal the mechanisms by which this bias that's not unconscious at all, is really explicit, comes to influence action. But it is the case that because of this very explicit sorting, officers are distributing different kinds of treatment to people in the city, often depending on where they live. And so when you think about some of the findings from the draft report and what the community is saying about who feels safe and how they feel about policing, and some of the divides, not all of them, but some of the divides around that, some of that reflects the fact that people get very different kinds of policing depending on who they are and where they live. And so some of the examples in our research, officers would talk about nice people, right? Business owners, normal families, primetime civilians, right? And then when they begin to talk about people who are living in areas that have been historically marginalized by places that people would identify as the ghetto, right? They begin to talk in ways that categorize the people as oppositional, right? As dangerous. They are oriented more toward aggression and threat. And they talk about the ways that young people in these settings are socialized into a particular kind of orientation toward the police, right? And I share this, and I'm sharing this briefly, the findings from the paper, just so that we all understand that when we're talking about whether it's police reform or transforming policing, that we have to understand that policing is not one thing in any place. And that's true. It's true for Berkeley as it is for anywhere else. This also matters because by their own account, officers admit that they're not unbiased or unconscious of their biases when it comes to policing. And in fact, they believe that what they're doing is fair, right? They believe that it is based on the evidence that they collect every day. They believe that this is morally competent policing. And I will say that each time I've presented this in front of a law enforcement audience, they've agreed that yes, this is how we think about policing. And so it's not because they're bad people, right? It's not because they're stone cold racist. It is because of how policing operates. And I think that it's really important to think about that when we're thinking both about how policing is embedded in space and the kinds of policing that's happening in certain places and what the implications might be. For example, if we say we want more police in this setting, right? Do we understand that police orient to that setting in really aggressive ways? And so if we want more police in this particular part of the city, that is going to deliver more aggression to that city, right? And so if you don't understand that piece of it, then that's not included in the formula. And certainly this policing, because of the way it's distributed across space, a structural mechanism through which inequality is reproduced in the city, right? It makes some parts of the city nice areas and some parts of the city not, right? And thus deserving of certain kinds of treatment and isolation. And I say this as well to caution us against thinking that a commitment or an investment in professionalization will do the work of undoing the systemic racism in policing and the consequences of that. Professionalization in policing, over the last 50 years, we have today the most professionalized police force in our nation's history. We have the most well-trained, well-armed police force in our nation's history. We still have the problems that we have. And so I think that when we get to this stage in efforts to address problems like this one, it can often be the case that we begin to work with institutions that are thinking in more narrow ways about how to address these problems. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. It is just that they are trying to solve the problem in front of them with the tools that they have. And those tools have been professionalization and training. And when you're trying to get something done, and they're the ones at the table, it can be really inviting, right, to begin to move in that direction. And I think it's really important to think about what does it mean, again, to hold that center and keep the work that you're doing really tied to the moment of that motivated all this work that folks are doing now. I do want to say something, quickly about what we learned from the complaints that young people in particular, young people in high surveillance neighborhoods in particular, had about policing. And these were, again, encounters that are recorded, and we're working on a paper right now, completing the writing for this paper. So again, once it's published and reviewed, we can share it out. But I think it's really important because one of the other kind of narratives that can disrupt this work is a really superficial narrative that Black people want the police, right? That Black people in certain neighborhoods want the police there. And what I try to encourage people to do as someone who studied Black communities, right, for the course of my career, is both to look underneath that and understand the diversity of experiences in Black communities and the diversity of experiences with policing, right, in Black communities. And so I spent a lot of my time more recently working, and trying to researching and writing about those who are the frequent targets of policing. And one of the things that we see is that young people, Black youth in particular, that's what, the work that I've done, are heavily surveilled. They are socialized into being a suspect at a very young age in neighborhoods where the police are concentrated. And certainly the argument will go that the police are there because the violence are there, but we also know that the police are there and the violence persists. And we have to ask the question, if we step out of the paradigm of public safety, what is this doing to young people? And how is it helping them to make sense of what safety means? And so when I just took a kind of cursory look at the report, that the draft, I'd be really curious if the task force could get a bit closer to those young people in the city, right? Most of the police contact is happening with young people, that not just in Berkeley, but generally. But the population or the sample, most of that sample that you have so far is above age 40. And so I think it'd be imperative to really get closer to young people and to get a sense of their experiences. I've written about the ways that young people are socialized into believing themselves to be, or understanding that they are being treated as carceral citizens, as people who are being cataloged for processing into the system, and that the system is not there to protect them, right? But it is to prepare them to move deeper and deeper into the system. And when you listen to what their complaints are, when it comes to this routine policing, what they are saying is that, they're making claims on a place that they've had a long, relationship to. And we know how difficult that is in a setting in the Bay Area in particular, where Black people and poor Black people have been displaced, have been moved out of communities. So the folks who are still there, right, they have a claim on this space, and whether or not they are homeowners, right, they still have a claim on the space in which they live and their families have lived. They want to be able to visit with people. And when you have, whether or not, they're on the lease, right? Or whether or not they live at a particular address, one of the things that you see when you begin to flood areas with policing is these everyday actions of people are surveilled, and they're stopped and they're questioned and they are searched, right? And that's a kind of experience that's not equally distributed across the population. It does something to the socialization of young people. And I think what's particularly important for this conversation is that what folks want is protection and safety, and they understand that particularly the low level kind of targeting and surveillance that's happening is not keeping them safe, right? So I could think about a young man in our data set who says, do we want security? Yes, make our people feel safe, but you're not making us feel safe, you're giving us grief, right? People come up here shooting, right? And you're over here telling me I can't stand in this particular spot because people gathering here is a problem of some sort that the police have been called on to surveil and enforce. And so once you start getting closer, right, to what young people want, right, I think you begin to have a better understanding of the system that ought to come from the work that we are all doing. And so if those voices, those who are most impacted, those voices aren't in the room, right, work will get done because work gets done, right? But will it have the kind of transformative impact that you want it to have, and that we all want it to have? And I will also, just to say just a little bit about, some of the challenges with having all of these encounters is that officers are also behaving in ways that aren't often captured on viral video, but in ways that are a kind of violence. And so they, and sometimes they are ignoring people's complaints. They are doing a kind of gaslighting, insisting on the legitimacy of their accusations. They are shifting accountability to other people. Well, it's not me, right? It's the board, it's the city council, it's the mayor, right? It's all these other people except the person in front of you who's accountable for the treatment that you are receiving. So it's this kind of constant shifting target. And the point that I make from that is that when you have a system like that that's not accountable, that in itself is what creates the conditions for abolition, right? Because what you see is young people making appeals that are consistently denied. And then the question is, as the question has always been, then what do you do, right? You either submit, right, or there's some kind of resistance, right, or retreat, or reimagining. And so I want to, I have been doing a good job of tracking time, so someone can maybe hold up a sign how many minutes I have left. But I wanted to share that piece of the work again as a way to remind us of the origins of and the demands of summer 2020, and what that calls on us to do. And I feel like in some ways, in looking around and just the work that I do, that the racial reckoning, I'm not, are we still committed to that work? And if we are, what does that mean, right? And abolition opened up a space. Some of us entered into that invitation, and I would encourage more of us to think about what does it mean to do this work with an abolitionist imagination, right? To challenge these kind of taken for granted assumptions about public safety, right? To do the work of reallocating resources, understanding that at its core, policing is about violence. It's about managing violence and the distribution of state violence. And one of the reasons why folks are wanting, for example, to shift responsibilities away from policing is not just about organizational efficiency. It's about that understanding of the potential for violence anytime you have an officer with a gun present, right? And so we can't do this work without confronting the violence that is policing. And it doesn't have to be an accusation. It doesn't have to be a critique. It is an empirical fact that that's the case. And then what do we do once we have that understanding? Right. And so part of the work is understanding what policing is, right? Understanding that it doesn't mean the same thing for everyone, that for some policing is a public good and for others policing acts as a co-constructor of violence and harm. It's policing in a city is a way to distribute the burdens and the benefits of whiteness, right? So who gets protection and who doesn't get protection in the city, right? And so if we understand that and we start from that understanding, then what does transformative change look like, right? It certainly does look like the kind of reallocation that we've seen in other places. It does look like allowing mental health professionals to take the lead. It does look like addressing the problem of affordable housing and homelessness in a city. And all of those things, some of that I've seen in the report as well. And I would encourage folks to think, to continue to think about how those changes, those structural changes are not about perfecting policing or perfecting the project of policing, right? They're about addressing these deep structural inequalities that we are very well aware of, I think, in Berkeley, right? And the lingering impact of those, particularly when we call on law enforcement to deal with the challenges and the consequences of that inequality. So when I thought that I could share some of that, and certainly some of the other research that we're doing, the kinds of concrete things on the ground that are making a lot of sense. One, shifting law enforcement out of mental health response, remediating vacant lots and greening spaces for sure, addressing commercial corridors. Ambassador programs, all of those things, we've seen some of that around the country. I've written about violence intervention that does not involve law enforcement, and certainly we've seen examples of that in the Bay Area, and I could talk more with folks about that as well. But I will say that when we think about the way that infrastructure can address some of the kind of problems that increase the likelihood that communities and people will have contact with the police, we also have to think, particularly in the Bay Area, about how these efforts could spur gentrification and further displace people from communities. And so, so I'll wrap it up there. I want us to, continue to think about and talk about, I work in Berkeley, I spend a lot of time here. And this is a powerful moment where we can really commit and invest in transformative change and be a leader in that. But I do think that it will require folks to center and deal with and confront the reasons why we are here, and not to lose sight of that as the months move on. And the pressure of getting a report or getting a plan out there, right, is really high. So I'll stop there and open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for that introduction, and really just a inspiring briefing to recenter us in our work here. So I'll go ahead and turn it to Commissioner Harder.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. I have two questions based on the content of the report, or the draft report. There is a recommendation for the creation of a progressive police academy, and I was hoping you could speak to that. And then additionally, the current model for our non-police response, the Community Emergency Response Network, is a co-responder model. And I was wondering if you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, so what we know from the research on co-responder models is that it is often the case that because of the deference that is provided to law enforcement, that law enforcement will take the lead, even if you have a professional, right, non-law enforcement professional and a law enforcement actor, one who's more skilled with dealing with mental health. For example, if it's a mental health crisis and a law enforcement officer, the kind of social dynamics of the moment lead a lot of folks to defer to the police, right? And so that is certainly something to be concerned, be concerned about and to have in mind. And it's also the case from the review of the research that we've done so far is that we don't necessarily see those models reducing the use of force, reducing the likelihood of arrest, reducing the likelihood of injury to officers or to people, to the targets of the encounters. And this is when it comes to policy and the criminal legal system, there are things that make people feel good that aren't necessarily effective, right? And that's the truth, that seeing officers on the street, for example, makes people feel good and feel safer, even if there's not necessarily like a really substantial increase in actual safety because the officers are there, right? There's some marginal increase perhaps. And then you have to think about, well, what is the consequence of the officers being there? If we think about, law enforcement as having the potential to do harm, right? Then how might that offset, feelings of safety, from others? And so what we see with, I think, what I would encourage people to think about are these community-based responses that don't rely on law enforcement and developing a system that actually responds to mental health crises. And so there are versions of this that we know we've heard a lot more about over the last 18 months, that even though they may have some connection with law enforcement, in very few cases do they actually call on law enforcement. And then there are others like MH First in Sacramento and Oakland, which rely primarily on the resources of the community to respond to people in crisis. And I think that if we think about what keeps neighborhoods safe and what keeps communities safe, it's part of that is social networks and connection, and the kind of prevention that can happen as a consequence of those relationships. And again, like this is a really good example of what might be more efficient to do. You already have a police department. You can incorporate a mental health professional into that because that apparatus already exists. But in Berkeley, you also have a mobile crisis unit, right? And are there ways, and you have community-based organizations, so might there be ways to build out a kind of model, either like MH First or other options in San Francisco and Oakland, also exist. But I think, again, you have to be aware of the limitations of those models, as well. If it feels like a quick fix, run the other direction, right? Because it's not going to get at the root causes would be my recommendation. We really are in the process of trying to build up a 21st century system of safety, of community safety, right? And we can't rely on institutions that were created in a different historical moment with a different set of concerns to do that work in the 21st century. It doesn't make much sense to do that. And I think that's part of why we have institutional crises in settings outside of, in domains outside of policing. The other piece was the police academy. I think that, what I said at the top of my, my presentation tonight about understanding the professionalization of policing over the last 50 years, with efforts that were trying to improve, the quality of encounters with the police, improve trust, do many of the things that we would think of as progressive policing, are now progressive policing. And yet there's a limit, and there's always a limit, in part because the problems that law enforcement is facing on the ground haven't changed substantially over the last 50 years. And what I say, like when you are an officer out there in the world doing the work, right, there's a great deal of autonomy, and you are going to figure out how to do the work there, in part by listening to what other people are saying about how you do the work there. And even with the changes that we've seen over the last 50 years, that has remained consistent. If you go back and look at documentaries on policing from 50 years ago, it sounds very similar to the way that officers talk about their jobs today. And that's even with all of the investment in professionalization. And so, again, I haven't read the report, and that piece of it deeply enough. But I will say that, I would not recommend using this moment to invest more in perfecting policing, right? I think that there are choices to be made about investments. I think that accountability and measures of accountability are really important investments to make. I think reallocating resources, I think shifting responsibility, those are all really important priorities. And you need to kind of keep that in focus, because certainly building new academies, and I read through the logic, and I can understand how folks are coming to that conclusion. And I don't think it will get, because of the function of professionalization, I don't think it will have as an immediate impact as some of these other transformations could have.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Commissioner Fine.
Thank you so much. It was extraordinary to hear you speak. I'm so grateful to be here. 911 was created to deal with civil rights protesters. It was not created as an emergency line necessarily for what we believe it's for. And in Berkeley, the police department has public safety dispatch situated in it, and a lieutenant of the police department runs dispatch. And through this reimagining process, the Berkeley City Council has proposed taking dispatch out of the police department. So essentially taking it out of that policing infrastructure. And partly through the reimagining, we have talked about this community responder model and how that might work with certain dispatch calls. Ones basically that are, what it really works for is ones that are no-brainers, vandalism, fender benders, that kind of thing. But as it goes up, then you get into messier territory about separating it out. And we're also starting a non-police crisis response program, which potentially could have a separate line for people who are afraid of calling 911. And what I'm wondering about this emergency and non-emergency system, because all of our calls default to police, is how can this make for transformative change?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And the idea that we call 911, like we didn't always call 911, is I think is a historical fact that people often don't appreciate, because there was a time when 911 didn't exist, right? And so I do think that having a different number, so the work toward getting like a 988 number makes sense. I think people in part call the police and call 911, particularly in this moment, in a decade, the early part of the 21st century, shaped by 9/11. If you see something, say something. So people have been recruited into calling the police, into seeing themselves as partners with the police, right? And there's a good deal of, what you might call propaganda or advertisements or encouragement, right? PSAs in order to do that. And so I do think there's a need to disrupt and to educate the public about both how to mediate conflict, how to de-escalate conflict, how to address problems at a community level without escalating to 911. And so so then, so there it does make sense, I think, to have those community responder models. And at the same time, one of the pieces that's tricky about this is that, people are calling over what seem to be minor offenses. So someone can correct me, but I think I saw that 80% of the calls are like non-criminal calls to 911. But people are thinking about the potential for violence. They're afraid, and they're afraid, it is at times a racialized fear as well. And so I think the work is to have these different routing systems, right, for people to call, but also to encourage people to think about local problem solving. Local problem solving. What does it mean to be a neighborhood? What does it mean to be a community, and to have resources in that community and ways to mitigate conflict in that community that don't require calling on law enforcement? And so I think all of this is moving in a really positive direction and kind of thinking about that. And I'll just put my fear and my kind of warning out there. And, probably what I get paid to do is to think about, like, these things, and the other side of these things is that if we, begin to peel away all the things that law enforcement is responsible for, we will still have the violence, right? And we know that violence is concentrated in certain communities. And so we will still have police in certain communities, right? Because the violence is there. And so that, and because they're there, it gives a message about those communities and people from those communities and people who look like those communities. And so that is why we have to get at the problem of addressing violence, right, in its various forms from somewhere outside of policing. Because if we don't, right, that core of it, the core of the problem will remain.
Thank you. Commissioner Hyde.
Dr. Jones, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Your experience and expertise are so needed, and I'm grateful that we could listen to you. So in reading the report, I have a worry that there are recommendations in the report, and I suppose any municipality would be facing this as we all wrestle with how to reimagine. And often, the top line, the headline means taking away budget, means taking away headcount. That's in this report as well. The downstream is probably headcount is shifted to CBOs and to other responders to Berkeley's needs out there on the streets. So I can't quite tell how that's going to fit with things like a police union and the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights and California state rules. And I wonder, as you've been exploring and watching other cities do this, what are your sort of theoretical thoughts? Were there any big red flags in what Berkeley might do that could be a thing that our particular union could really have some trouble with? And are there any municipalities that you've seen and how they've navigated this that we can learn from, or who have had some innovative ideas?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And because so much of this is so new, I don't know all of what's happening around the country. I think, that people are working this out in Minneapolis right now. They're working this out in Ithaca with the mayor who's declared, that they are going to, abolish the police and reestablish this system of public safety. So those are the places I'm trying to learn from. And those are the places I would encourage, folks to take a look at as well. And to anticipate, and this is not based on any particular expertise with the union, and Berkeley, but to anticipate massive pushback from the union. That's what we have seen in the expansion, in the expansion of power of police unions in particular over the last several decades. And so I am not expert in negotiating with unions. So, but there are some folks on campus who, have thought about how to use regulatory processes to instigate change. And I can direct you, or if you look online, to a symposium that was held on this at Berkeley Law School. I think it was last year. And folks can follow up with me and I can help you get, access to that resource, because that's where I am going to try and understand what's happening. But certainly one of the challenges, and this is again, not speaking to any particularities about Berkeley, although I've had more experience on campus and working around policing and advocating for accountability on campus, is that we moved really quickly out of this period of reform that involved the community and required community engagement. And when the community was involved in that kind of conversation with the police, typically the community deferred to police, right? And even though it seemed to be this like egalitarian kind of working together, really the paradigm of policing is privileged, right? Because they are the professionals, they are the experts, right? And that's how people typically are socialized to treat people, who have institutional power in that way. And when we had this shift over the last 18 months to really accountability, really wanting to, shrink the footprint and challenge some of the power and the authority, then the relationship goes bad really quickly. And I think that's just something to anticipate the possibility of. And then the question is, what do you do, right? And what can you get done under those conditions? And certainly there are, there are politics everywhere, but that there possibility in working with other institutions so that they are taking up more responsibility, and that doesn't require the permission of law enforcement to do, right? And so I say that to say that it doesn't have to be antagonistic, but it is about power. And it is, the change that we've seen is often, at some level, has to be a confrontation with the violence and power of policing. And again, because that is what it is. And so any solution that's going to address that problem, right, has to confront it.
Thank you. Grateful for your thoughts.
Mr. Linton. You're muted.
Apropos of the last comment, I wondered what your thought was about how Oakland had very defund, abolish focus to now both of the two leading mayoral candidates calling for, let's get cops from wherever we can find them from around the country. We'll import them from here. We'll import them from there. And everybody absolutely freaking out. And in a sense, Minneapolis voted down the charter amendment. And so I don't know, I just wondered kind of how your response to that or what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah. And so what I think is interesting about Minneapolis is that it was voted down, and yet you had a significant percentage of the population, not a majority, but short of majority, 40% or so, who were in favor of the kinds of changes that they simply would not have been in favor of 2 years ago, in my professional opinion. So that I think shows some progress and kind of more openness to these ideas than have existed previously. And I think that's because of the calls that have been made. I think that what's happening is in Oakland is what we will see in cities across the country with this kind of reactionary response to spikes in violence. And the violence, in places where it has spiked in places where policing has not been defunded, right? And yet you have these spikes. And what we have more generally, if we kind of zoom out, is we have increased aggression seemingly everywhere. Like we are moving through this social transformation of the pandemic. We're moving into 18 months of this chronic stress. We had a mental health care crisis before the pandemic, and all of that has been exacerbated, right? And so you go into the air, you go on the street, you go to the grocery store, right? There's a kind of a level of tension and aggression that feels to me, palpable. And so certainly we have that, sorry about that. So we have that. Sorry about that. So I think that what we have to do when we think about the violence that is, and I've studied violence. The tragedy of it is real. I've written about this, and I know that we will get marginal returns, short-term returns from any increase in policing, and the fundamental problem will not go away. It will make people feel better, and certainly some people feel better in the moment, and certainly there's a politics to it. But I think it's the wrong response, and I think that we have an opportunity both with the infrastructure, investments, and what will come after that. If we see that can happen in Congress, we have an opportunity to think much more creatively of how we address these problems and what we invest in. And so, I think what's really important for folks who are committed to this work is to continue to do it, even when people don't think it's, the right thing to do. If it's the right thing to do, and when it's not popular, and when the politics start to push back. I mean, this is the retrenchment that I spoke about from the very moment, right, this all unfolded. You can anticipate that this is going to happen. And yet, you have to continue moving the work forward, in part because there will be another crisis. I would hope that it would be nothing like we just lived through. And yet we know, right, that it's quite likely that there will be another moment of crisis, and the ideas that exist in that moment are going to be the ones that move us forward. And so all this is to say that, again, you got to stay close to what the problem is, and that as you understand it, and do the work and build out from there, and really, not miss the opportunity of the moment. So that's to say that I think we are missing the opportunity of the moment at a political level in Oakland, but on the ground, what people are doing is the work of moving things forward. And that is where I have a lot of faith in the potential for transformation, because I see folks doing it.
Thank you. Commissioner Dangerfield.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Mizell. Thank you, Professor Jones, for coming this evening and speaking, as it were, truth to the power of the situation. You mentioned using regulatory schemes, perhaps as a way, or the apparatus of the regulatory systems to bring about change. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what that actually entails. If you can nail down any of those details, it would be much appreciated, because I'm interested in how that might work.
Yeah, I can't. That's not my area of expertise. But if you follow up with me, I can send you some resources. Yeah, okay. to understand about that a bit more.
And what's the best way to follow up with you?
So njones@berkeley.edu. Yeah.
Okay.
But
okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I guess a few questions. Again, thank you for joining us, Dr. Jones. I guess first one, and again, I'm sure you're well aware, but just I'm sure you have awareness of the Kerner Commission and its findings. So in the Kerner Commission, again, as I'm sure you know, a number of grievances were found to be, at least in the opinion of the commission at the time, the main causes of disorder in American communities in the mid to late 60s. And I'll just list them off here real quickly. On the first level of intensity, the first three were police practices, unemployment and underdevelopment, inadequate housing. The next three on the second level was inadequate education, poor recreational facilities and programs, and the ineffectiveness of the political structure and grievance mechanisms. And then the third level of intensity was the disrespectful white attitudes, discriminatory administration of justice, inequality of federal programs, inequality of municipal services. And then our last two here are the discriminatory consumer and credit practices and inadequate welfare programs. And at the time, the commission strongly recommended that the United States as a whole and that municipal governments in their local and regional capacities, expanded investments in these grievance areas exponentially. Now we're 53 years later. And I guess in your professional opinion, as again, we're again seeing proposals, obviously in Oakland, as Commissioner Linton mentioned, here in our own city, a proposal is waiting at the Public Safety Policy Committee to bring back a crime suppression unit. And the references, and I bring it up because it references this reimagining process as part of the reasoning to bring back a crime suppression unit. So when we look at this big picture, Professor, in your opinion, what are the changes? What different steps do we need to take to avoid another 50-year cycle of seeing the same problems without any meaningful change and with only one thing really expanding, which is the police?
Yeah. Well, I think, there are a couple of things to do. One is to resist the reactionary politics, resist the moral panic that is been stoked over the last 18 months and that is coming, and will make things like a crime suppression unit seem like a reasonable response, right? And we've lived through this, 53 years ago, right? And we lived through this in the 80s and 90s, right? And the question is, are we going to allow that to repeat, right, itself again, whether or not it's attached to the explicitly racist rhetoric that it had been attached to in the past, right? And so again, resist those reactionary politics around what to do with the problems of human challenges, the problems of violence, the problems of mental health crises, the problems, of homelessness, right? Law enforcement is not the solution to that. And many will admit that they're not the solution to that. And so really the question of the moment is, what is the role of law enforcement in society, right, period, right? And what is it in our city, right, in the places around us? The other piece of it is to remember the lesson of the Kerner report. So the Kerner report was very clear, right? What white society ignores and Black people can never forget is that white society created the ghetto, right? They maintain the ghetto, right? It serves white society, right? But if you ignore that to your peril. Two societies, one white, one Black, separate and unequal, right? And who's doing the work of maintaining those boundaries? Law enforcement. And how are they doing it in the Kerner report, right? Officers act in explicitly racist ways. What do I mean by racism, right? They talk about Black people in animal terms. That's a paraphrase from the Kerner report testimony. We know that still happens today. Like officers use, codes like, or acronyms like NHI, no humans involved, right? And that's not to say that everyone across the board does it, but it's a profession that allows for that to happen, right? In part because of how it's organized. And even with all of the professionalization that has happened since. So what we know happened, post-Kerner, and Elizabeth Hinton has written about this, historian, is that we shifted from these grand ideals of the war on poverty to the war on drugs, right? We're in this moment where the fault lines of our society have been exposed. What is the solution to that, right? What is the solution to that? I think we know the social investments are the solution to that. And we also know the barriers and the challenges, right, that come along with enacting that or implementing that or investing in that, even in a liberal city, right? I mean, that's the kind of contradiction in the paradox of the Bay Area. And so, part of the work is to be aware and not to be distracted, right? Because we do have the potential for a different kind of investment. And it is so easy, right, to be dissuaded or distracted from that. I don't mean to suggest that any of this is easy work. It is not. And it requires a laser-like focus on racism and the violence of policing and an understanding of what the investments that are actually needed are. A laser-like focus, because it's so easy to get off track in service of getting something done, right? But it was an expansive national investment in policing. We saw police training expand, and a market around policing emerge. And that's what we're dealing with. That's what we're contending with. It's not just one police officer on the street that is a problem. It is it's a whole institution. It's a market around it. There are a lot of people invested in policing.
Thank you for that. And I guess as a follow-up, obviously, speaking for myself as an individual, I take the realities of harm created through crime very seriously. They have affected very strongly friends of mine, my family to a lesser extent, at least in this country, but certainly others. I understand very seriously how crime can create serious harms. But again, in your opinion, as you've gone over and appreciated the history and the reforms we've already seen with policing, I often joke with folks that Berkeley police are probably the most reformed police department in this country, given that this reform started with August Vollmer over 100 years ago. And there have been numerous reform, professionalization efforts since. But I guess again, a bit off track here. So in terms of that harm, in your opinion, would it be smarter at this juncture in time, where we are tasked with reimagining public safety, at this juncture, to invest more in the same institution that has failed to prevent crime, failed to change these underlying issues in our society that produce the conditions for crime? Or should we invest in something else, even if that full image and picture isn't quite clear yet? Is that worth working for?
Yeah, I think so. And I get there, I think that sometimes people can confuse a personal belief and a professional understanding or conclusion. And so I have traveled through this question over the course of my career, and where I've come down after 25 years of study, 17 years as a professor here in the UC system, is the necessity of investing in other systems, in part because of the work that I've done and work very close to the violence that you talk about, right? And so in my last book, I write about a young man who began to turn his life around as he was entering his early 20s, right? He had been, in the drug economy, low-level drug economy since he was like 12, made his first $20. But by the time he gets to his 20s, he wants to do something else. And he tells me about how his treatment, right, by the police, right, made him, wanted to I don't want anything to do with this whole system, right? I'm gonna do my thing, take care of my family and all that, right? And it begins to turn his life around. And I think that, as I meet him as he's doing this, and I'm thinking that, I'm gonna speak at his graduation, right? Because he went back to community college, he was turning things around. And I end up speaking at his funeral. And I have these video records because of someone in the neighborhood, right, who collected video recordings of police encounters for years and years and years. I have these records of law enforcement investing a lot of time and energy in this young man, searching him meticulously and his car, making him feel as if he was, in his words, not a normal citizen. And none of that protected him. The thing that was changing his life around was the investment in education, right? And so and that's a contradiction that I try to bring to, the fore in my research. And it's not, you don't have to feel, some kind of binary way about it, but you have to account for it. You have to account for the fact that we saw this great crime decline in the 1990s onward, and it made some communities more safe than others. And it turns out that those communities that historically marginalized, crime goes down, but it's been chronic, and it's been chronic there even as law enforcement resources are targeted there, right? And you have these periods of suppression and then back up. And that's true in the Bay Area too, right? Suppression, back up, suppression, back up. We have these spikes, right? And so it's not at the levels where it was, but it's still chronic. And so what you can get at best is suppression, but you don't get change. You don't get fundamental change. You don't get transformation. And the most negative ways in which we see that happen is large scale displacement of communities, right? And what we have an opportunity to do now, either through displacement, either through incarceration or housing or, those kinds of negative forces. And you have the potential to invest in other ways. And you have a city that's small enough to get your hands around in some ways, right? Understanding that the challenges, particularly around violence in the Bay Area, they're crossing borders, right? And so you have to think about, what that means for the city and what it means to invest in, protective forces in the city. But certainly my professional opinion at this point is very clear, right? That this is a really important moment. And we can have more of the same, or we can have change. But I share that story again, just to, if you put yourself, you and the person who's a target of violence, you want the same thing. You both want to be safe, right? And so some folks have an idea of how to stay safe. What is that? What would safety mean to that person, right? And how do we begin to imagine a system from that perspective, right? What does it mean to feel safe as you're walking down the street, right? As a queer woman, I'm walking out, queer Black woman at night. What does it mean for me to feel safe walking down the street? It doesn't make me safe to feel more police, to see more police. I would tell you that. But what would, right? And how do we use our resources to create those kinds of worlds?
Thank you. Commissioner Harker.
Yeah, kind of extrapolating upon what you were just speaking on, like, are there any particular programs that you've seen be effective in dealing with the kind of violence that you're describing?
Well, there are, we have to think about different kinds of violence. And that's particularly true in Berkeley. That's such a diverse kind of space with different, ways that people are living in the city and how they're coming into the city, how they're moving about the city. So certainly as we're thinking about gun violence, there are certainly programs, community intervention programs that don't rely on law enforcement, including the Richmond model that has evolved into advanced peace. That invests in young people, centers the value of young people's lives. The outcome measures, are they still alive in 5 years, right? Are they still in 3-5 years? And there's been some recent evaluation. Jason Coburn, a colleague at UC Berkeley, has evaluated that program. It turns out it's also cost effective, but again, that shouldn't be the motivating factor necessarily, right? I know other people in other positions have to think about that more than I do as a professor here, but the outcome measures are different. What we know that those who have been most marginalized, and we think about some of this transformative work we're doing now, sex workers in New York City were answering this question decades ago and developing strategies to stay safe. So I would direct people to the work of people like Andrea Ritchie, right, who was on the forefront of this conversation, right? Because there are models and there are practices there that we can learn from. One pattern of violence that hasn't been talked as much about is the increase in domestic violence through the pandemic, right? And so what resources do we have to address that kind of violence? And there's research to show that when you have a law enforcement intervention, particularly for non-white middle-class populations, that it could actually make people's lives more dangerous, right? And so we have to think about what kinds of interventions can help people to, what kinds of resources exist to keep people safe. So I say all that to say we have to be thinking about the various forms of violence, right? And also understanding that policing always has the potential to introduce harm and violence as well, even with the best intentioned officers, right?
Commissioner Fine.
I just wanted to ask, I know you mentioned Minnesota and Ithaca. Are there other places where you would recommend we look for transformation as well?
I think the places are, some of there are examples in the report of efforts to, to make these changes. So Austin is another place that comes to mind, and thinking about what it's done with shifting away resources from the police department to housing. You had an experiment in Brownsville, New York. It was last summer or the summer before. Time has kind of worked for me in this pandemic, where they, intentionally had law enforcement pull back and flooded the streets with like community resources. And through this period of time, they saw calls to the police drop. So there are these experiments all over now, and people have been figuring out the most marginalized folks have been figuring out this question around safety for decades. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. And so places like Interrupting Criminalization have published zines online that have a plethora of resources and examples of experiments in all of this. I mean, and that, it's almost overwhelming how many resources exist now just in the last 18 months, in part because so much of our worlds were lived online, and because of all that's happened.
Thank you. Yeah, one last quick question from me. I was thinking how to phrase it. Yeah, I think often, in conversations I have around these topics, there is the perception that to some level it's almost whimsical to begin a process of really delinking our public safety from policing and creating something else. Obviously I can't point to a place in the US where there are no police or even very few police, and yet a successfully running community. Now, obviously my response is, well, we haven't tried in any meaningful way in this country to make that happen. But I guess I want to ask, is there any way you make these, changes and reinvestments more real to folks, more tangible to folks than, merely the thoughts of a Berkeley student who, hasn't seen the real world enough or doesn't really understand how things will work out there?
Well, think about the transformations of the 20th century. Like, think about what we're doing right now, right? There have been transformations, right, that have changed our lives, and that that have improved our life, right? In some ways, in other ways, maybe less so. But there are these institutions that are kind of deeply embedded in our social life, not necessarily because they are effective, right, but because of politics and power and investments, and because the origins from which they sprung serve a purpose today, right? And part of that is, when we think about law enforcement, the history has been the control of labor, the control of non-white populations, right, and the control of Black people, and the control of workers. So that interest still exists. So what is the interest of the public in the second decade going into third decade of the 21st century? That is the question. And so certainly any place like Berkeley is a place where we should be kind of thinking these things through. I will also say that the question is not, for me, I mean, it is less interesting about what we should take away from the police than to think about, although it's important because it becomes a political battle, but to think about, like, what do we want to build up, right? What do we want to build up? I mean, we're changing the infrastructure, around, our petro and economy, right? And how are we doing that? Investments in infrastructure are going to have charging stations across, right? There are ways that we change our environment, right? So what is it about this particular piece of it that prevents that? When we think about what to build up, why do I like thinking about that? Because it connects me to a set of thinkers who have thought in whimsical ways, right? Imaginative ways about freedom, and in particular Black freedom, right, over the course of our history, and have worked toward it and have achieved it, even if only for a moment. And so I go back to the work of W.B. Du Bois and what his writing about abolition democracy. What is abolition democracy, right? Understanding the failure post-emancipation to invest in the social institutions, the labor, the education, right? The health of a recently freed population, right? And you didn't have those social institutions built. In some cases, including the criminal legal system, you had institutions that were built explicitly to prevent that, right? So what is the project of the 21st century? Part of the project for me that's way more interesting is to use that as a blueprint and to say, what would it mean to build up that space here? And again, so much of this is local, right? How do you make this block safe, right? How do you make this neighborhood safe? How do you make this commercial corridor safe and inviting and welcoming, right? Not just to white people who have money, right? Those are the very concrete questions that you can be inspired, right, by what might seem whimsical, but you have to figure that out on the ground. And that's our work. That's our work.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions for Dr. Jones? Going once, going twice.
I have a question.
Commissioner Dangerfield.
Thank you, Chair Mizell. I just wonder, Dr. Jones, what the cultural predicates then that exist in American culture around which we could even pivot to not just reimagine, because of course, the thought experiments and the writings and our intellectual tradition can help fill in some of the gaps, but there seems to be a lack of a cultural impulse toward the kind of societal peace that I think we're trying to reimagine in the end. I just wonder what would be your opinion about those pivot points, given just the serious and deep institutional and history of oppression. What do we hope to pivot around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the way that I think about this question is that there is a tradition of freedom fighting, right? There is a tradition within the law, right, of expanding rights. And there are real barriers there now, and have always been historically. And so, part of the way that I'm thinking about this moment is probably how, many of you are thinking about this moment. This is a really tough moment in history, right? And yet democracy has always been precarious, right? There has always been oppression. There's always been polarization. There have been battles that people have won that seem far more daunting, I'm sure, at the time than the ones ahead of us, right? But what does that mean for the day-to-day? What has that meant for me? That has meant for me to work side by side with people who are both imagining and dreaming, because that is really important, and creating new worlds in different kinds of ways, right? Whether it's the kind of the policy making or art, to be in that space, and then to be shoulder to shoulder with people who are trying to do the work, understanding that it is not likely to be entirely realized during our time. And our time on this planet is precarious as well, right? So what are we going to do with the time that we have and the work in front of us? And I'm not just saying this to you. This is what I say to myself, and this is how I place myself. And it doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, because there's work to be done everywhere. But I think that the way that we figure some of this out is in the doing, right? And the change, it may be happening and we don't even see it. But I will tell you that this conversation has the potential certainly to be co-opted and diluted. And it's a kind of conversation that was not happening 18 months ago. That's an opportunity. As opportunity. I've used that as an opportunity and work that I've done to build out foundations that are difficult to topple, understanding that other people are going to have to continue the building.
The hope of the promise, then, I suppose, is the that's my answer, I guess. Why it is we continue to try and move this forward is hope in the promise. And I guess that is about what our democracy winds up being the net result of, is how we engage that question. So I just want to thank you again. I really appreciate the perspective, and it brings home the need to stay grounded in the tradition that you just mentioned. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank all of you for doing this work. Like, I get it. It's late on Thursday night. Folks that are doing other things in your life. This is hard work. And I appreciate the work that you are doing. I appreciate
it. Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. And yeah, I encourage folks to read The Chosen Ones by Dr. Jones. I know it's very informative, transformative book for me in terms of seeing the perspective of folks that we more or less spend so much time talking around and about in these meetings, but don't really hear from. So yeah, thank you for that work and for taking the time.
Yeah, you got to get them in the room. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Alrighty, let's go ahead then to our subcommittee reports. Starting with police. And Buna, you want to start?
Whew, you're not even going to give us a couple of minutes, huh?
No breaks. No,
no breaks. This is not est. We should get breaks. We were lucky enough to get the latest report before our subcommittee met yesterday. And overall, our sense was of disappointment. We were expecting, I guess we were expecting more information in terms of if you cut patrol, what happens here, that we still don't have enough information to make any decisions around reducing the workforce itself. But then the other disappointment is that all through the report, there doesn't seem to be much that has been absorbed in it that has come out of the recommendations of different subcommittees, of the suggestions, the requests, that it still seems like this report in some ways, and I don't mean to be cruel, but it does sound cruel, was in some ways already written, and then the Berkeley pieces got added in. It doesn't, so we talked a lot about now what, how do we move forward, seeing that that this task force probably wants to make some of its own recommendations. So we came up with how our committee would work. And then since then, Nathan and I have talked and met and have come up with some next steps in terms of how best we can get not just our pieces, but also what the community input was. The report mentions all of the appendices, but in the reports, very big important chunks are just not there. It says 2,500 people answered the survey, but it doesn't say what they said and who they were. So which city council person then has the time to go, into the appendices and say, oh, so who did they talk to? Where did they? So to us, it felt like our work has gotten a little harder, and that this is a real opportunity for the task force to step up and start doing some I think we've done a good amount of critical work around what we've been getting from Nick Jr. and have done our share of responding and done our listening sessions, which are also appendices. Doesn't say, there isn't, it just feels weak. I don't know how the mayor and the council what their approach will be. And it doesn't have, Pam's got her hand up, thank God, because she knows I'm like trying not to say the things that I really want to say. I'm waiting for the next steps conversation, because I believe that that the time has come for this task force to step up and speak our knowledge, our truths, and what we think will be best for Berkeley. Pam?
Well said, Buna. I wanted to ask, well, we've got Cheryl and Amir on the call. There remain a few things missing, and I just wanted to make sure that I didn't overlook or not catch it in an appendix. Was there a dollar figure that y'all put to the Progressive Police Academy? That's one of the big ideas. It is quite big. Did you guys give a scale for what investment would look like from the city of Berkeley in terms of dollars in that?
So off the top of my head, and Amir might be able to respond as well, but I don't think there's a specific dollar figure, because the recommendation is collaborating with other cities to make a regional, to have it be regional, to diminish the burden on Berkeley, right? So it's not an investment by Berkeley. It would be a collective investment. To answer your question, there is not a specific dollar figure.
I wonder, is that something that we could ask of you if, that's a pretty heavy lift to recruit other cities, try and team up and craft that sort of thing. I could just really use a sense of scale about what you're suggesting in that part of the report. And if Berkeley, for instance, it has to be the majority owner and driver of this, can we ask that you guys look at other police academy? I mean, I know we could look at the Alameda County one that's run, nearby here. Is it San Leandro? I forget. Anyway, I'm really aching for some scale on that. It is a big idea. What were you guys thinking?
Well, currently it's $4,500 per officer. That's what current training costs. So if you just shifted that to a different, from a military style training to a guardian style training, then you're shifting $4,500 per officer. But I can look into kind of seeing if there's a way to get you numbers. It's a little complex, given the fact that it would be a regional training, right? That would again lift the burden on Berkeley, but I can see if there's a better answer that I can get for you.
Great, and that 4,500 figure is a helpful reference. And so what you're saying is that all the recruits that come out of known, or specifically the Alameda County current police academy, the spending on those people who graduate is the 4,500?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And also, it's not just the Alameda County Academy, but 3 other academies around that our folks come from.
Right.
Everybody's not necessarily trained at just the Alameda County.
Sure, right.
Mr. Harker, anything to add in terms of reporting now?
This maybe is not like the proper time to ask this question, but it's also not really proper in the next agenda item either. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. So we've got all of this information from Nikki Jones. She just gave us a whole bunch of interesting things to look into. And I was wondering if NICJR is going to follow up with any of that, or is that something that the task force should expect to take on by ourselves?
I mean, I think a lot of what she referenced are things that we do. Advanced Peace is our partner, reducing the footprint. She referenced some things that we do. She referenced some cities that we currently work with and put into the report. So I definitely, I mean, I appreciate her presentation. I think it speaks a lot to our footprint of reduce, improve, and reinvest. So I think that if there are specific things that you would want us to look into, I think that both can happen. I would encourage the task force to do additional homework as well.
Okay, thank you.
That's it, Chair.
Thank you. Okay. We'll hear from our other subcommittee. Anyone like to report out?
We were eating turkey.
Oh, that's a good report too.
Yeah. No, I mean, in all seriousness, we didn't meet.
Okay.
We had a holiday.
Certainly a well-deserved.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you mind if I just add? So we didn't meet, and the
Yes.
report did come in just the other day. And so we haven't had a chance to review it, but I hope I speak for our committee in kind of also saying that it doesn't look, we provided really extensive comments on
Yes.
the last version of the report, almost zero of which have been addressed at all in the revision of the report. And so it was not something we discussed because we didn't meet, but I think there's a grave, I think with our subcommittee, I can say probably some grave disappointment around, you know, there was specific language provided around things and just none of it was incorporated. And again, one of our main, and again, I barely had time to review the report, but one of our main comments was just that there is no specific ways in which the harm that has been caused in the city to the communities who have been harmed is being addressed. That is like a central theme that we just don't see. There's all these solutions to doing things, but there is this need to address the harm that has been caused. That and many other things, but that is a central piece. And so again, I hope I speak for my other subcommittee members in
you do
saying that. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to add in that way, you know, empathy and meeting the needs of people in their communities and doing that through the collected community engagement research. It makes it human and personalized for our communities and not part of a formula that can be placed in different cities and localities. I mean, it's about what makes us Berkeley. And we, even in the earliest draft of the alternative responses report, gave a very thorough list of our CBOs. And we did it by population, by African, by Black, by Latinx, by LGBT. We have, as a task force, have gone way out of our way to ensure that every population in our community is covered, both through the citywide survey and ensuring that it was expansive by population, and also that gender equity, mental health, LGBT, and Latinx were covered. And then we get a final report that simply doesn't integrate those findings. And it, especially in terms of increasing equity to improve the situation with certain CBOs that are in our city. So I think that really is kind of not only disappointing, but, you know, to put a lot of time and meet 4 times as a subcommittee and draft all those recommendations and write them out, it almost seems like, you know, dismissive and abrupt.
Thank you, Commissioner. Seeing no other comments, we can go to gender-based violence subcommittee.
Is Bernali here? And I know Francis isn't here, so that leaves me. You had something, this is the cover of our report. It is in your packet. And as we've been meeting, we have been reporting to the full task force our progress. And we're hoping that you have had time to read this. And if you haven't, because I believe this came out with the packet, that you do so. It's an excellent piece of work, as was the last report from the other subcommittee that Margaret and Liza are on. And it's our expectation that Nick Jr. will read this and consider that this entire report be inserted into their report in the section that's around gender violence. And we can give you some more time. Folks, we're not going to meet again until January the 6th. So if you have any, this report is not going to change now. So my request is to please read it more thoroughly. It's very good. It makes recommendations, and it has a budget attached for those
Can I
recommendations.
give some more?
Bernali is here. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I give some more context? Yeah, I'm here. I made it. Before we go to Commissioner Fine's question, if I can just contextualize some
Yes,
and
please.
highlight some of the things. So you'll see that the non-police response, there's two sets of recommendations. There's a non-police response, and then there's a second part that is about changing how police reacts now. And we did that because police, for legal context, still are engaged in doing work around gender violence. So in the first part, you'll see that some of the things we found is that the organizations that do this work in the city of Berkeley today are very underfunded. So even the work that we know needs to be done is not being done or funded to the level that is necessary. So it's a very sort of simple thing that we learned from providers. The other, and then you'll see that there's also training for community members in understanding of these issues. That's number 2. Number 3 and 4 are both about prevention. So really getting to roots, starting.
Your camera is frozen.
Yeah, I think if you can hear us, I think we've lost you, Commissioner Ghost.
Let me see what happened. Yeah, I think Bernali was talking about prevention and intervention, which would be the non-police response recommendations. And we made recommendations like increase the capacity of community-based organizations serving Berkeley residents, students, and employees by providing additional funds. And go on to say that, how much that will take. But also what was interesting for me, at least, not interesting, but meaningful, was that not only did the information that we get from the organizations that we engaged with was absolutely just right on, because they've been doing this work, they understand it. They also understand very well where the police fit in and where they don't. The other piece was that we sent a lot of questions to our police division, asking the people that do the DV work currently a number of questions, and they answered almost all of our questions.
And that I think brought up more recommendations from our side.
Yeah.
And the second part is really bringing the city of Berkeley in line with the best practices of other counties, because we had folks in our listening session who work in other counties and were asking us questions about, say, language access, or when you update your domestic violence policies, are communities consulted? Are the CBOs consulted in that? So that's what the second part is. And and most of this work was this writing of this report and putting stuff together was done by Frances. Unfortunately, because she's not well, she couldn't be here. So we may not be able to answer all of the questions that you have, but we encourage you to send it to us directly. And one of the things I do want to point out, I think Buna said this also, is that there is a list of costs. And to start with, it's under $1 million. But the impact can be huge. And I think under $1 million for all of these things that we're trying to do. Yeah, I think that's really affordable and cost effective, even though we're not talking about cost effectiveness as the only measure, obviously, but it is. So that's where we'll leave it. And we know that we haven't,
one other thing I wanted to point out was that one of the programs that we're asking for at a cost of $150,000 is services for people who cause harm. And it was important for us not to just look at one side and not look at the other side.
Yeah. And we have shared this report with the folks who were at our listening session. And if we have their consent, you will also see all the folks who were involved. So right now, we're not listing them, but we had a really great group of service providers. And as we mentioned before, we did not talk to folks who are survivors because we didn't have the resources and the capacity to do that in a way that would seem, I guess, just it didn't feel ethical for us to do that at that moment. But we do encourage the city to do something like that in partnership with the CBOs if possible. So yeah, I'll stop with that, and maybe we can, hear some comments, but we may not be able to answer everything.
Commissioner Fine.
Yeah, since we're all together and we won't be together again, I guess, until what's the next date?
January 6th.
Okay. We're really talking here about a task force report and what that's going to look like. And I think Buna really hit that nail on the head. I am so grateful Nikki Jones came tonight. She was really inspirational for my doctorate. I read one of her books like 3 or 4 times. I took extensive notes, and I think that they're very important for our report. And I'm going to look into more research around it because she really just nailed themes that are surrounding policing and inequality and communities and neighborhoods, and just on the ground level that made sense about addressing our policing infrastructure. I think that the subcommittees put a lot of time into critiquing the report, writing about it, and now Nick Jr. wants us to give them our time going through their recommendations and saying whether we agree and what's our justification. And really, quite seriously, I put out and I did it with the subcommittee. There were 8 of us. We put them together and we posted them. And really, in some ways, a lot of that is the core of what I would write about for a task force report. And the 2 subcommittees are split in very logical ways. One is covering policing, and I think you're doing some stuff with dispatch. And we've been covering the CBO, the BERCDOT, the SCU. And as far as my own time, which is limited, I think that's really important to get down deep into the community engagement research and look at it and see what it says about our needs and what kind of programs we need and how that's going to happen and how it fits with our CBOs. And I think that is the kind of thing that council needs to know, because they need to increase the funding. It's not just this 25% across the board. It's like, how do you do it in a tailored way that's culturally safe and responsive and serves our unique demographic populations? And that's how I want to spend my time. As far as the co-responder model, the tiered dispatch and the community responders, we've talked about this, and bottom line is there are definitely CAD calls for service that can be taken right now and given to some community responders. But I don't want to spend all my time on that because this is about reimagining public safety. It's a big umbrella. and it includes a lot of parts. And as a task force, we've just worked too hard not to pull ourselves together. And I know the policing subcommittee's met since April, and you have a lot of extra content that's super important. So I think like with our time tonight, we got to figure out our strategy for getting this done, because this is key.
Margaret, it's the next thing we're going to do.
Okay, all right, I'm stopping right now.
Agreed. Fully agree. Any other comments from gender-based violence subcommittee? Oh, Commissioner Ghost, actually, you have your hand up. Okay. Sure, let's go.
I was just a little confused by Commissioner Fine's comment. No, not your comment. Just I was expecting to close out the conversation on the gender-based violence subcommittee before moving to next steps.
Yes,
So,
no, please.
Can we just do that and
Yes.
then
Yeah,
we'll have the discussion. So yeah, so if anybody has any questions, you can ask now, or ideally we're asking that you send it to Shamika, and Shamika can forward them to us. We would appreciate any comments you have, even ones that say this is great, let's include it in the final report, or any tweaks that you might have, and especially any red. I think we're looking for red flags primarily. Yeah, for me that's it, I think. And I really like the format of the report, and that there's a budget, there's some thinking on costs that makes it real for us, and that it's very specific to Berkeley as well. So Buna, anything more you wanted to add?
no, that's it.
Should we set a time by which we want the comments to come in?
I think
Could be, I think,
anytime in December. But I need to ask staff, both Nathan and I need to ask staff a few questions around how we're going to get work done in December, because we're not going to have staff available. And that's why the task force is not going to meet as one body until January. But some of your questions are about to get answered.
So yeah, so if it could be in before the end of the year, or
Absolutely.
earlier, even better, and that gives us a chance to incorporate the changes, so they can be incorporated in the final Nick Jr. report as well. So thank you. We're really missing Frances. She really did
she
such a
worked
great job
so
and
hard.
so
So big kudos to her, and it's unfortunate she's not here.
and to you, Buna, for doing this work
To
for
you,
so
Buna.
long, obviously. Yes. Thank you all.
Thank you both.
Shamika, are we ready? As soon as our
Yes,
chair tells us.
If I may, Chair and Vice Chair, it was mentioned in the conversation earlier that the next meeting was January 6th, but I wanted to just add a point of clarification. The task force has not voted on that date as of yet. Okay, so that's in the future, in a later item on the agenda. Thank you.
So,
Vice Chair Chima, do you want me to now share my
yes,
screen?
please make me host, and then let me see if I can get this happening. Cross your fingers, everybody.
There you go.
Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, can everybody see this? Yeah? Can you
No,
folks?
we're
It's on
not
my,
seeing anything.
it's on my screen, Shamika.
That's okay. I'll do it for the sake of time. I don't
Thank
mind.
you. And we're early, so thank you.
Okay, no worries.
We're going to be done by 9:30, I hope.
Give me 1 second, okay? Everyone,
Okay.
please.
So should I take it off my screen?
Yes, so you can see. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
I can see it. Thank you all.
Okay.
Okay, I have to do something else. Yes. So this is like our moment. I feel like this might be the most important moment in the life of the task force. I'm not going to say anything about the past. because we really want to move forward so we can get the work done that was supposed to be our role in the legislation. So, so it's important to have a process so we can get first, Nathan, would it make sense for us to take a vote as to whether we want to vote for our own task force report or yeah, that's a simple vote. Because I don't think the next steps fit if there isn't an agreement to do that.
Yeah, I would say from my view, obviously we need to vote, as you said. I think we're going to have a report of our own in some form, just given the realities of this process so far. I would be remiss for me as the chair of this task force to allow so much of our work to go into the recycle bin and not to council where it belongs. So I imagine we're going to have our own version of the report, which hopefully can, have complementary elements where possible. But I think that's just a reality at this point.
Okay. So what I'm recommending it, and some of these suggestions also came from Cheryl, is that the two subcommittees keep meeting during December. So we're ready for at least on January the 6th, ready with two reports, one from because we want to look at the entire report from our lenses. The lens of the Reinvest subcommittee and the lens of the police budget subcommittee, because they do sort of, it all runs, it's all one big system of public safety that we're trying to create. So what we're hoping is that we will work in December, that each subcommittee will create an introduction, including our experience as a task force, weaknesses and strengths of this process. And then create a report which reviews recommendations by Nick Jr. with feedback as to which can be supported. Which recommendations can be supported but have major weaknesses. Write what the weaknesses are and how the recommended project can be strengthened. Scroll, please, Shamika. And decide which Nick Jr. recommendations cannot be supported at all and the reasons why, and defend your subcommittee's position and offer alternatives if appropriate. If it's like something and your committee says, no, can't support it, and no, there shouldn't even be an alternative because we have something, no, that comes in next sentence. Create your subcommittee alternative recommendations, and it should be or recommend new initiatives. And my little guiding principles were less is more. So be succinct, be bold, and be courageous. So this is like, I kind of feel like I know most of you see me as a very calm, peaceful person, trying to make sure everybody gets along with each other. But the second version of the Nick Jr. report really made me think about what approach to take. And I think we would not be serving our city well. I'm thinking more about the people in our city, not serving the mayor or the city council or city staff, but we would not be serving the people who put us, who have trusted us to bring them back something which they can look at and say, this feels like my community is going to be safer. And in some way, I'm going to be engaged in making that safety happen. Is that we have no choice at this point, but to write our report, make our recommendations, support the recommendations of Nick Jr. that we agree with, make changes to the ones where we feel could be strengthened with our changes. And then that whole piece that Margaret's talked about, reinventing in the community and in the community-based infrastructure is a huge chunk, because we can't we can't create new systems and yet not on the ground have enough capacity to respond to what might be coming, what kinds of folks with what kinds of problems might be coming to these out of CERN or I'm tired. But I think you're kind of like rocking with me on this one, that I'm pushing for, as is Nathan, that we do produce a report that stands alone. It might have some similarities to the report that's been submitted by Nick Jr. But my other reason for saying that a report from the task force is critical is because we're producing the kind of work. And now both the Gender Violence Subcommittee report and the Berkeley piece that was in the report and other pieces really need to be front and center in front of the city council meeting and not attached to a report that I at least feel is weak in many areas, and then just be added as appendices. So that's my position as vice chair. And what I'm hoping, or we're hoping, is that January the 6th, that before January the 6th, and we will ask staff if staff can support us exchange our two reports with each other, so we can come on January the 6th, see where the commonalities are between the two reports, where some differences might be, and then create a process to take those two and make them into one cohesive report. That's how far I got. The other piece is that we could also create, on January the 2nd, we could create a subcommittee that would manage the formation of this report. So everybody could send their content in, because I'm sure even after the 6th, we'll still be writing content. And that would then be put together as a report, edited, looked at, and be ready, hopefully by the second meeting in January, if not the first meeting in February. Please throw everything at this process, because let's just improve it.
Yeah, I'll just open up to folks to speak. So Commissioner
Yeah.
Fine.
And then somebody please take notes if we change these things.
I just,
go ahead.
yeah, I'm just going to refer to on the Reimagining Task Force page are the Berkeley City Council objectives that were passed on July 14. And I really think like we should take ourselves back to even May of 2020. You know, how did this get, how was this started? What happened with George Floyd? And at least, I mean, really, the council wants to hear about what it put out there. And some of it wasn't even addressed during this whole time period, but I feel like that is something that we might want to do.
Yeah. And Nikki reminded us of that is, you know, keep an eye on the, yes, months have passed and the council has already been putting more money or thinking of putting more money into the police department. So, so we almost have to recreate that moment to remind people, hey, this is why you created all this. And then look at each of the categories and see where the gaps are and see if we as a task force can fill some of those gaps. It's a lot of work, folks. It's going to be a lot of work, but I couldn't find any other way to move forward. So this was what I came up with. Moved both by, yeah, I think confidence that we have people on the task force who could pull off, if each person can write their piece and what is most important to them, then we have the capacity to pull it all together.
Yeah, let me Sorry to backtrack here. Secretary, can we go to public comment for Kelly Hammergren? Just in case, not sure how long she's had her hand.
So are we done with this item, Chair Mizell?
No. I just want to make sure if she's had her hand up since the last item that we didn't miss her.
Thank you. I was looking for the unmute button. Thank you so much. And thank you for the last speaker, Nikki Jones. I mean, that was fabulous. What I wanted to ask is that as the public, we've not really been able to see the report, what you're discussing right now. And I was hoping that that could be posted in some way. It seems that there's been a lot that's been turned in that we haven't been able to see. And if that's possible, it would be wonderful. And then I would just like to suggest that if you posted your reports far in advance of the meeting, you know, as soon as they were ready, then that would avoid any Brown Act issues and would make communication back and forth possible, and it would be available for the public to review in advance. So that was it. Thank you for letting me speak. Thank you for calling on me.
Thank you. And yes, we can definitely check with staff about, you know, making sure we got all of our reports up and obviously the reports we've talked about as from subcommittees. So that may be the ones, but happy to check on that. Okay, sorry to interrupt the flow. Commissioners.
Chair Mizell, we have another public comment. Thank you.
Sure, let's go ahead.
Carol Marasevich, you should be able to speak now.
I am also looking forward to seeing what is in public posted and the subcommittee reports also posted. But in addition to that, after hearing Nikki Jones, I was looking for some specifics beyond the inspiration message. And there were a couple things that were thrown out that referred to infrastructure and transportation, corridors, that were somewhat of new territory when in responding to a question about specifics. And it seems as if you need to explore that and also explore the other jurisdictions that may not have been considered that Nikki Jones, Dr. Jones referred to. I hate to say that anything's premature because I know this process feels as if it's been going on forever, but it seems like you don't want to leave those stones untouched. That there's still more to look into, and perhaps the subcommittees can do that before you actually finalize your report in January. Thank you.
Thank you.
So to carry on the previous conversation, the piece that Margaret talked about just now is, I believe, Margaret, remind me if when that happened, that at some point there was a letter that was sent to the mayor and council that actually spoke their process back to them. But I can't remember at what point, because some of this stuff has already been written.
That's true.
Yeah.
And some of it
haven't stopped working, looking at, for example, we'll have a full analysis of the Austin model any day now, to see how that might be different from CERN. And we have a number of reports. You go through the appendices, there's some important stuff that I think should be, you know, in the councils on their desks and not in their staff person's dustbin. So does this seem reasonable, folks?
I really got to hear from folks right now.
Yeah.
Really, if you got a thought, if you're thinking about it, if you're like, this chair and vice chair have no idea what the hell they're doing, this is really the time because of our meeting schedule. So, anything.
Or I'm going to hear silence as agreement. And then Alicia has her hand up.
Yeah, Commissioner Harder.
Yeah, could we, maybe I missed it, but could we get a copy of the document you just shared screen on?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Would you be
And
able
then-
to share screen again just so I can read through it? Sorry, I kind of.
Shamika did that.
Would it be possible to see it again?
Sure.
Thank you.
Secretary Cole, you have something?
Well, I just wanted to answer your earlier inquiry that the reports have been posted. The subcommittee report that was discussed in today's meeting is part of the agenda packet, December 2nd agenda packet. And the Nick Jr. report is also posted on the website. So every report that we discussed in all of our meetings are posted on the City of Berkeley's Reimagining Public Safety Task Force page.
Thank you.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Lutzker.
Hi, thanks. I mean, I think that this is, given the constraints of Brown Act, a very reasonable way to go about things. I guess first and foremost, I'll just mention a concern. I don't know if there's any way around this, around the timing, right?
Yeah.
This continuing to meet during December and January. Many of us, myself included, have children who are at home, not in school for several weeks. People have family commitments during this time. So I do just want to put out there that this is a difficult time for people to be working on this. So I don't know what can be done about it, given the timing of things, whether there's any flexibility. That's just
There's one
a
thing
question.
is that if we took the month of December to at least have all our sections that we want to then maybe write more about, by the 6th, then we can continue to fill out the content. Can that be achieved?
So yeah, I guess I'm, so after the 6th could be kind of like finalizing of the report and editing and putting everything together, that the 6th would be a meeting to.
Because
and did I hear you
it
correctly?
won't go to council until the middle of February, probably the first week or second week of February.
And did I hear you correctly, Vice Chair Chima, that you were saying that there might also be a separate subcommittee that would be formed after the January 6th meeting to kind of work on ironing out the, organization and editing?
Yes.
That, okay. Yeah,
And
I mean, I
have
think
your name on it.
I'm happy to do some, organizing, editing work. That's fine. Yeah, I mean, given it is just hard, there is the, December and people are at work, but it's also, right, everyone's trying to get everything done before they go take vacation. So, I mean, I think that's the timeline that we're presented with. I think this is a good approach to it. I'm supportive of it, but just acknowledging that it's.
Yeah, I also feel that we have more done than we think we do. That could go into our report. We'll have to look through these 200 and some pages and see what can be pulled out that didn't get integrated into the Nick Jr. report. That's why I said less is more, be succinct, knowing that all of us are bold and courageous anyhow. But I agree with you. I mean, it's a very, very short timeline. So what I'm hearing is if by January the 6th, either of the subcommittees don't have a full or very close to a first draft, that we give ourselves another week after that meeting. And by January the 12th, the 13th, 14th, start doing the work of merging the two and editing them and putting them together. as one report from the task force. Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, my first instinct is in subcommittee is to get an outline done of what we need to do. And, you know, when I look at what the council passed, you know, almost a year and a half ago, I mean, some of it is naturally policing work that the policing subcommittee would take on, just like the police academy or reducing the footprint of the police. And all the presentations that were done by the Berkeley Police Department, and what about that would be reforms. And I mean, you all are experts in that area, and you would know how you would outline it and what you would do. And I think, like, you know, the fifth objective, aspire to reduce the budget, but do it by generating resources for that big list of programs, you know, from housing to food security and stuff. I think some of this is naturally in the outline the council set forth in the legislation, and that, you know, we need to sit down in each of our subcommittees and outline what we're doing, and then dive into the content and the research. And I feel like I really need to go through this final draft report that was done. And I know we have loads of emails and stuff that just contain a lot of content in them as well.
Yep. So can we get an agreement that each subcommittee will meet early next week, come up with their own process? But in terms of, see, there's like a couple of things. One, the task force has to agree on which recommendations to support that are coming from Nick Jr. Two, which ones we would support if we had more information or clarity. Then what might be our initiatives that we want to push forward? And that's where I think there will be some differences. So for example, if the police subcommittee says Berkeley does not need a regional academy, because not only does that add more work on our city to try and get a regional approach pulled together during these times, but we have an alternative way of getting those pieces of the training that our police officers might not be getting in the academies, and that could be available in Berkeley for them, even at our community college. So you don't have to create a whole, I'm just using that as an example.
Commissioner Ghost.
I don't know. I've been, I agree with Commissioner Letzger just about the timing of this, and also that I haven't been able to participate in our subcommittee meetings just because it's been overwhelming for me, and I've been focusing more on the gender violence subcommittee. But I'm also wondering, the folks who are not here today, the folks who we haven't heard from so much, how are we, when we go to vote on this as a commission, how will our report be seen as a commission report if we're not able to get participation, engagement, and the consent of every member of this commission that this is the way we want to go forward? I mean, we'll probably get a majority saying yes, but is that the process we want to follow, or do we want to engage as many folks who are on the commission as possible to sign on to one report versus the other, which is what it's coming down to, which is...
No, I don't think it's coming down to one report versus the other, because some of the things in Nick Jr.'s report we might be agreeing with.
So then we should call this something else and not say it's our report, because you're right. I think you're right that
we could call it the task force response to Nick Jr. report.
I like that. I like that. Let's call it that. Because then it's in conversation with the Nick Jr. report and not its own thing that then council has to like struggle with. So in some ways, if you
Well, maybe if they're struggling with that, they won't be creating these special crime units. I'd rather they struggle with our reports.
yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is, in that sense, if it's a response to their report, then I can see that some of the work has already been done, especially with the comments that we've given them that have not been incorporated in any way. Like that becomes the foundation for the report. The part I worry about is the duplicate. Like, I understand that each of us needs to have the conversation, but is there any way to prioritize which conversations we should be having as a subcommittee? Or there's no way we both do the same process, there's duplication, and then you're saying that another subcommittee takes all of that and massages it into one response?
And that would come back to the task force for a vote twice. I think we're going to have to vote twice.
Yeah. And I think my frustration with the Nick Jr. process has been that they've not asked. I feel like we were never asked for any recommendations. That, we were never asked for what things should go in the report. And so this is an
Because
opportunity.
it's their
for us.
report. They've been very clear from the beginning that it's
No,
their
but
report.
we had like community engagement, but never the commission. The commission was never engaged in the conversations. It feels like the recommendations came out of thin air. I mean, we've all said this.
Yeah.
We've all said this. We all know this.
So let's
whoever's spoken has said this. Yeah, I just want more people to show up to do the work. That's all.
We have 24 people here.
Yeah.
Some are visitors, but I think there were 3 or 4 commissioners.
17 people, of which.
And they're going to hear about this by going to their subcommittees.
Yeah, so I feel like if a chair that we should call on each person to say something.
Okay.
About yes, no, can do, cannot do. So,
Yeah, that's fair.
That's the pulse. I would like to know what the pulse of the commission is today for who's present. Thank you.
Can we take a couple of comments before we do that? Alicia has her hand up, and so does Pamela.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Pamela.
That's okay. I'll jump right in. My big question was, I believe that not everybody is on a subcommittee. Do I have that wrong? If I do have that wrong, that everybody is represented on one of the subcommittees, then great. So I see heads nodding. Does that mean that everybody is on one subcommittee or another?
Yeah, we made sure of that when at the last, not the last meeting, the meeting previous to that. Yeah.
Okay, great.
But not everybody has been attending.
Sure, right. But at least via the subcommittee channel, everybody is on one of those subcommittees.
Yes.
Great.
Commissioner Ejiku?
Hi, thanks. So Commissioner Ghosh did mention that there's probably going to be some overlap on our recommendations between the subcommittees. And if it's appropriate, I'd like to just plant a seed and suggest that one point of overlap or duplication might be what Commissioner Lutzker mentioned earlier, and that is the very much needed repair in our community of the harm that's been done to specific populations and to individuals in our community. I can imagine that being very relevant in the policing subcommittee and also very much in the Improve and Reinvest subcommittee.
Thank you. Alicia, do you still have your hand up or?
Yeah, I do.
Okay,
Something
for it.
just come up for me, so I am about to have to hop off the call. My apologies. But I just wanted to say, since we're doing a little round robin, that I'm down for this format. In terms of like redundancies, what we were saying in our subcommittee is like it's much better to have redundancies than to have gaps. And so I am like very fine with the idea of us overlapping. And I know that most of us will have like reduced capacity just because it's the holiday season. I myself will have more capacity because I'll be out of final season. So I'm happy to jump in.
Great. Thank you. Other commissioners who are here, let me see who hasn't spoken.
Doing that real fast. Let's go ahead and take a vote just for the 6th. Since we lose Commissioner Harder, I want to make sure we just get it in here. So I'm a motion to schedule a meeting for January 6th, 2022. Whoa, 2022. And yeah, I guess from that meeting, we'll figure out our next one.
Second.
Call the roll, please.
Commissioner Fine?
You want to come back to this?
Yes.
Commissioner Jigu?
Yes.
Vice Chair Chima?
Yes.
Commissioner Crook?
Yes.
Commissioner Linheim?
Yes.
Commissioner Dangerfield?
Yes, but I won't be able to attend.
Thank you. Commissioner Ghosh?
Yes, and similarly, I might have some conflict, but yeah, I don't want to hold up the process.
Commissioner Hyde?
Yes.
Commissioner Malvito? Commissioner Thompson?
Yes.
Chair Mizell?
Yes.
Commissioner Opton? Commissioner Moon? Commissioner Harder? Commissioner Letzger?
Yes.
Motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Bruna, you have the floor.
So does anybody else want to speak to this process, or can we all sort of do our very best by January the 6th? Because it'll just be a few days before that. And Shamika, a question that I had was, if we have our first drafts done by early January, what would be the earliest date that staff could get this out? With
So
the
if you have
agenda and
it,
with everything, with the packet.
you mean ahead of the January 6th
Yeah.
meeting?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would have to be 1 week before.
1 week
So
before.
December, yeah, let me look at the exact date.
Well, we come with as much as we can get done, and then decide what more needs to be done on the 6th, and then carve out those tasks.
So December 30th, Vice Chair Chima, but you and Chair Mizell, we can coordinate in our check-in meetings better.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sounds good. And we can, well, I know we probably won't have the date yet, but figure out what date exactly council wants to have these things, since I know usually they have a pretty early expectation for getting items. Okay, any other questions or comments on our next steps? And again, thank you, Una, for your work to even come up with this. And obviously you and I talked, but yeah, I'll be honest, folks, even with the several Brown Act bodies I've been on now, it's still difficult for me to plan out exactly how to get work done effectively in these bodies. I enjoyed the mayor's working group a little bit more because it wasn't a Brown Act body, and we just said, okay, well, let's just meet up, get on the same
Yeah.
Google Doc, go to the same place, and hash this out. But thank you, Buna. Okay, well, I'm not looking to extend the meeting for no reason. Is there any, let me see, any other public comment hands? There are none. Okay, I will motion to adjourn.
I will second that happily.
Commissioner Fine?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Ejidu?
Yes. Good work tonight, everyone.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Chima?
Yes.
Commissioner Crook?
Yes, thanks everyone.
Commissioner Linheim?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Dangerfield?
Yes.
Commissioner Ghosh?
Yes.
Commissioner Hyde?
Yes, and thank you, Vice Chair Chima, for structuring what's, to come. That was very helpful.
Commissioner Malvito? Commissioner Thompson?
Yes.
Chair Mizell?
Yes.
Commissioner Opton? Commissioner Moon? Commissioner Harger? Commissioner Lutzker?
Yes.
Commissioner Hou? Okay, motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you,
Good
everyone.
night. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Shamika, have a
Good
good
night.
December.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, Vice
Thank you,
Chair.
Chair, Vice Chair.
Thank you,
Bye.
Shamika.
Thank you both. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, appreciate